second lecture test in here that will cover the heart and blood vessels. So chapter 18 and chapter 19. From now on, you can expect a test every week. Okay? In the last couple weeks, a couple tests a week. So be prepared. Pardon me?
On Thursday, she gets softer and
Not
softer.
necessary. Not necessary. The only thing I can promise you is you won't have a lab test and lecture test on the same day. That's all I'll promise. That's the day it's going to vary, okay? The lab tests are set. That's on your lab schedule. But the lecture test can vary a day or so, or where we are, okay? But not necessarily on Thursday. Okay? In fact, your very last lecture test, which will be your final exam, will be on Tuesday, July the 3rd. That's our very last meeting. So you will not have to come back after the 4th of July weekend, okay? I think it's kind of stupid, but anyway, I didn't say that. I don't give exams over a major break like that, because the 4th is on a Wednesday. So that's Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, a 5-day. And of course, everybody's diligent in studying, I know, on the 4th of July. Some instructor will bring you back to take it, on the 5th. Or, after the 4th of July weekend. But no, you'll have your last exam, final, July 3rd. That is posted on the Pell site, by the way. Hopefully you've seen that. Okay. It'll be in here, regular time and place. Okay. But I will announce the exams beforehand, so as long as you're attending class, there'll be no surprises as to when they are. And your lab tests are as scheduled. So unless we have a hurricane or bomb threat or something like that, they will be as scheduled. Okay? Don't get any ideas. Yeah, I think they're jail, which they should be. It's not fun.
It happens all the time.
Did it? Well, it was happening here too. The last one knocked out a whole afternoon basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some people think it's funny, Well, I don't want to take the exam that day. I don't want to come to class, so they call it bomb. It's like yelling fire in a theater, which used to be, or on an airline, they don't take that as a joke either. Okay, you go to jail. Okay, we've been talking about blood pressure. And remember, blood pressure is, of course, the pressure exerted by the blood on the vessels which contain it. And we saw it has to do with several things. One thing, of course, is cardiac output. The greater the cardiac output, the greater the blood pressure. We also saw its total blood volume. The greater the blood volume, the greater the blood pressure. We'll talk more about that later. Okay. We've also talked about factors, basically, that increase pressure. We talked about these before. And we talked about, for example, resistance. And when we talk about resistance, okay, resistance is, of course, the friction, due to the friction caused by the blood flowing through the blood vessels. And not surprisingly, most of the resistance is what we call peripheral resistance, which is that we see in the smaller blood vessels. The smaller the blood vessel, the more blood in contact with the wall of the blood vessel, which means more friction, more resistance. We talk about 3 factors that are responsible for resistance, particularly peripheral resistance. Okay, what are they? Blood viscosity is one, okay? Viscosity is defined as resistance to flow. So it's basically the thickness of the blood. Okay, and several things can contribute to that. What can make the blood more viscous? What? Okay, if you've been burned, why? What happens when you are burned and you lose skin? You weak fluids. You can become very dehydrated. Of course, that comes out of the blood as well. So that's one thing, would be burns. What else could cause increased viscosity? What? Polycythemia, where you have more than normal number of red blood cells. Sometimes a pathological condition, polycythemia vera, that's usually due to a tumor in the red blood cells or mutation of the body, which of course is the red bone marrow. Okay. resistance to flow, okay? Or anything with dehydration, okay, could cause this. The blood will get literally thicker or viscous, and of course, that's viscosity. Okay, that's one thing. What's another thing that can increase resistance?
Blood vessel length,
Pardon?
blood vessel length.
Blood vessel length. The farther the blood has to course through your blood vessels, and we're talking about miles here, okay, not just a few miles, but thousands of miles, believe it or not. You got a very extensive vascular network in your body, which is why almost any little cut, you're bleeding, okay? Because you're going to cut a blood vessel. And if you cut the skin and there's any blood associated with it, you know you've gone down to the dermis, okay? If there's no blood, usually means that you haven't penetrated the epidermis, but the epidermis is relatively thin, so it doesn't take much. So blood vessel length, and usually what we see an increase in blood vessel length is when a person puts on extra weight, because with the tissues, regardless of what they are, and often in adulthood when we grow, okay, we're not growing this way, we're growing this way, it's usually fat or adipose. That also has to be supplied with blood vessels. So the heavier you are, the more weight you're carrying, the more blood vessels. And what does that mean? More resistance, and it also means often higher blood pressure. People that are overweight, especially terribly overweight, often have problems with blood pressure. And that makes the heart work harder and can predispose you to things like heart attacks and strokes. That's why they say, you know, one of the predisposing factors is weight. And unfortunately, we tend to be getting heavier, okay? Something like now they're saying 2/3 of the adult population is actually overweight. And it's getting worse, and unfortunately, children of parents who are overweight often are overweight themselves. And we're seeing an increase in type 2 diabetes, which has to do a lot with your lifestyle. Type 1 is basically where we have the destruction of the pancreatic islets, which produce the insulin. That can be due following a viral infection that knocks out your cells there that produce the insulin. But that's much less common than type 2. Type 2 usually comes on later and has to do with being overweight, not having enough exercise. You're producing insulin, but your body's not responding to it, and your blood sugar tends to be too high. That's much more common. We're seeing an increase in type 2 diabetes, and unfortunately it's coming on earlier. We're now seeing children start to go into diabetes. And a lot of those overweight children of overweight parents are going to end up with type 2 diabetes. So it's not good. Like I say, that's a big problem. We like to eat, okay? We like food. And there's often an abundance of food. And even now in some of the developing countries, people have problems with weight, which I found astounding. I thought, you know, most people in developing countries are malnourished. No, a lot of them now are overweight as well. Okay?
In China, their children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really. And China now is not a developing country anymore. They're still a little behind in things, but they're booming, and they're going to be the next superpower. They've got resources, they got the human resource, now they're getting the technology, and beware, okay? But up and coming. You're going to see a lot more in the future. And what's the third thing? Diameter of the blood vessel. Okay, so we talked about blood viscosity, we talked about blood vessel length, okay? In both cases, directly proportional to increase in blood pressure. Increase them, so there's blood pressure, and then blood vessel diameter. Okay? And what we're talking about here is vasoconstriction, contraction of smooth muscle in the blood vessel wall. That narrows the diameter. Okay? What does that do to the blood pressure?
Slows it down.
Brings it up. Okay? Brings it up. Well, think of it. You got a pipe with a fluid flowing through it, and you suddenly increase the diameter. What's going to happen to the pressure of that fluid within it? It's going to go up. Okay. And that's vasoconstriction, contraction of smooth muscle, all right, which narrows the lumen. With vasodilation, you increase the diameter. So as we saw, with an increase in vasoconstriction, or narrowing that diameter, the blood pressure goes up appreciably. Okay? I gave that little formula. You don't have to memorize that. No, I'm not going to ask you that on the test. I'm just illustrating that with an increase in, or decrease in diameter, a certain increase in blood pressure. Of those three factors, okay, assuming the person is healthy, they're not putting on weight, okay, they aren't suffering from polycythemia or had a bad burn, okay, or hemorrhaging, okay, what's the most important as far as contributing to peripheral resistance? Which are the three? Blood blood vessel diameter. And this goes on all the time. We're changing blood vessel diameter according to the needs of the body. In fact, we can shuttle blood one way or another by constriction of vessels, reducing blood flow. Okay, so blood vessel diameter with vasoconstriction, vasodilation. Most important in determining peripheral resistance. Okay? And notice too that peripheral resistance, okay, is a more important factor than the difference in the blood pressure in determining blood flow. Any questions on this? Okay. Now we've talked about some of this before in lab. The systemic blood pressure, the arterial blood pressure, this of course varies during the cardiac cycle. By now you should be familiar with systolic pressure. Systolic pressure is the maximum pressure in the artery. And that's following ventricular contraction. A young healthy adult at rest is approximately 120. 120 what? Millimeters of mercury. Hg is the chemical formula for mercury. And that's the way we usually express pressure in the metric system. In the English system, it's inches of mercury. Like the barometer, they say the barometer is falling or rising, usually like 30-something or 29 or something like that, okay? And usually with a change in pressure, you can determine also weather conditions. Falling barometer usually means what? Good or bad weather? Usually bad weather. And now, officially, tomorrow, we enter hurricane season, okay? Falling barometer could be tropical depression, tropical storm, or hurricane on the red. Okay? And generally, high pressure associated with better weather. So you like to see a rising barometer rather than a falling barometer. Okay, diastolic pressure, this is the minimum pressure, which of course is following ventricular relaxation. And again, it's measured in millimeters of mercury. So like 120 over 70 or 80, okay, a typical blood pressure. Again, this is blood pressure at rest. And the blood pressure is going to go up with activity, as you know. Pulse pressure, I think you know by now. You should know by now is the difference between the systolic and diastolic pressure. That's the range of pressure in the arteries. And notice too that the pulse pressure terminates at the end of the arterial system. So after that, we no longer have a pulse. We just have a steady blood flow. You do not detect a pulse in a vein. You only detect it in what? An artery. So when you're looking for a pulse, you're trying to find an artery, okay? That you can actually palpate, feel it, and feel that pulse, that surge. What you're feeling, of course, is a surge of blood following ventricular contraction. As that blood streams through the artery, what it does is cause a slight swelling. That's what you're feeling. And then, of course, it usually recoils, goes back. And obviously, the pulse can be stronger the closer you are to the heart. Where would you have the strongest pulse? In what? What blood vessel? Aorta. Okay. A little hard to detect the pulse there. Okay. So usually do it in some other one. And typically where we do it is where? Maybe here, or if you're mechanical, usually here. Okay. People get very sensitive when you're, put your fingers up here, put them around the neck. Sometimes you'll see runners, okay, they're doing this, doing that trot. And what kind of pulse is it? What artery?
Common carotid.
Common carotid. Okay. And down here, what would it be?
Radial.
Radial. Okay. And again, when you do the pulse, you don't do the thumb. The thumb has a pulse of its own, so you usually do these two fingers right there. Okay. And always thumb side. Various members do a thumb side. We don't be doing this. Right? Okay. Mean arterial pressure. It's another thing that we talk about in lab. You should be familiar with this too. This is basically the working or average working pressure in the artery. And of course, it's equal to what? The diastolic pressure added to a third of the pulse pressure. So pulse pressure over 3 added to, not multiplied, not subtracted, okay, added to the third of the pulse pressure. Okay? And again, like I said, it's an average working pressure. Okay, if we look then at the pressure, of course the pressure is going to diminish or decline as we go farther from the heart. So as you go to smaller and smaller arteries, as you expect, that pressure is going to drop. It's farther from the source of the pressure, which is the contraction of the ventricles. So we will see a change in the pressure as we go farther or diversion in the arterial system. This will be a textbook. And you can see up here, let's say we've got a pressure, systolic and diastolic pressure. This would be systolic and diastolic. Okay. let's say an average healthy adult, notice again it's measured in millimeters of mercury. You can see as we go in the aorta here and major arteries, you'd see that. And then as we go to smaller arteries and in the arterioles, which are the smaller ones, pretty soon you can see you can't really detect much of a pressure, not much difference between the systolic and diastolic, and eventually it's uniform. And then it drops, of course, as we go through the capillary beds, even more when you go to the venules, which remember are draining the capillaries, these are small veins. And as we get into larger and larger veins, because remember venous system is a convergent one, where you got smaller vessels feeding the larger vessels into larger and larger. And by the time you get to the vena cava, you can see, if you look at the pressure here, it's essentially zero. And that's why the venous system needs help in returning that blood to the heart. The pressure generated by the heart is simply not enough to return that blood. Okay, so the capillary blood pressure, you can see when the blood enters the capillaries, typically it's about 40 millimeters of mercury. And again, we're figuring on a systolic and diastolic pressure of 120/80. You can see it's dropped considerably. Once it has passed through the capillary beds, it's usually about half what it was when it went in. So we come in at about 40 millimeters of mercury, the blood emerges on the other side of the capillary bed at about 20 millimeters of mercury. But this is enough because the capillary walls are very thin. Remember, it's simple squamous epithelium, there's no loose connective tissue, and the capillaries are permeable, even the continuous capillaries. And the fenestrated capillaries and the other capillaries, which are sinusoidal capillaries, are even more permeable. This pressure, though, is enough to force the fluid, soluble-containing fluids, from the blood into the other tissues. And again, it's in the capillaries that exchange with other tissues occur. Oxygen nutrients usually going into the tissues, carbon dioxide and other waste products coming out into the blood. Okay, so it's not just gases being exchanged, but it's also nutrients and waste products. Nutrients taken up by those cells and waste products given off. When cells metabolize, they need nutrients, okay, take in, just like we need to take food in our body. They also give off waste products, just as we do. So the cells have to be fed, but they also generate waste products in their metabolism. And the obvious one is carbon dioxide, and also usually excess water and various other things they give off. And these things then are usually filtered out by what organ? But basically it's filtering your blood, all the impurities, okay? Metabolic waste, not digestive waste. What organ? Organ you can't live without. That's the liver. Kidneys. Kidneys, okay? And we pass out waste products, okay, from the kidneys in the form of urine, all right? Like you say, you can't live without the kidneys. You can do with one, can't do with zero. You can live without two kidneys, but you can't live without a single kidney. If you don't, if your kidney shut down, what happens? You end up on dialysis. They hook you up to a machine, and what they're doing is basically running your blood through a machine that picks out those impurities, and you got to do it periodically. And then, of course, you're a candidate for kidney transplant. Okay. So on the other side, then, of the capillary beds, the capillaries, remember, being drained by small vessels. We start on the venous system at about 20 milliliters of pressure. So you can see it's already very low, even by the time we get to the venous system. And of course, as you go from smaller vessels to larger vessels, that pressure is going to drop even more. So by the time you get to those large veins, okay, like the vena cava, which are carrying blood into what? Into the right atrium, it's essentially zero. That's why, too, when a vein is severed, it's a slow, steady flow of blood. There is no pulse in a vein. And the blood flow is much slower than it would be in an artery, because there is no pulse. And it's steady and slow. Arterial bleed usually have pulses, okay? And the blood comes out in spurts, not in a vein. Now, because the blood pressure is so low, as I said, the veins need help in returning that blood to the heart. They can't rely on blood pressure alone. One thing is, like many large lymphatic vessels, they have these one-way valves. That helps to keep the blood flowing in one direction toward the heart. Another is they have a very large lumen, okay, which reduces resistance to flow. Because in a large blood vessel, there's less blood coming in contact with the wall, so less peripheral resistance. again, the veins help to prevent the backflow, and these large lumens help to reduce peripheral resistance. This aids in returning the blood. And then we see some of the same things that we saw in moving the lymph, the skeletal muscle pump. Okay, not only do the lymphatic vessels run through skeletal muscle, but so do blood vessels, as you know. When the skeletal muscle contracts, what does it do? It bunches up and it squeezes anything running through it. Lymphatic vessels and also veins. When you take a tube that's full of fluid and you suddenly squeeze it, what happens to that fluid? It's going to go out away from the point of constriction. With one-way valves, it can only go one direction. In this case, it's going where? To the heart. That's exactly what happens. So, exercise helps circulation. You probably know that. Okay? Exercise is very good for you. You've been told that since you were a child. You know, exercise. As you get older, it's a little harder to do. Well, I don't feel like it. I've been working all day and I'm tired. I just want to lay down, you know, relax in front of the TV, you know, fall asleep.
Exercise is a
Right, and push the button. That's exercise. And, you know, it's easy to say, you know, mañana, I'll put it off. I'll do it tomorrow. I'll start that exercise program, okay? Until you have that first heart attack, okay? Or whatever. So, skeletal muscle. When that muscle contracts, it helps to pump the blood. It helps to move the lymph, but it also helps to return the blood to the blood vessels. And that's why when you're moving around, you're facilitating circulation. When you're just not moving, of course, it's slow. And that's a problem, too. With non-ambulatory patients, the circulation is not as good. A lot of older patients, especially if they are confined to a wheelchair or a chair or to a bed, they often have circulatory problems. And it compounds the problem as well, of something they may be suffering from. So, remain active as long as possible. That means you have a regular exercise regime, if possible, okay? Don't pull up right to the building, all right? Park as far away as you can and walk, okay? Much better for you. Don't take the elevator. Walk up the steps, all right? And here in this building, there are all 2 levels. I see all these people come to the elevator, you know? All right, it's one thing you got something to carry, all right? You got something heavy. But it's quite another when you just walk there and you stand there waiting for the elevator. Walk, okay? Exercise. The best exercise and the cheapest exercise is walking, okay? Don't have to all this fancy gym equipment. Don't even have to go to the gym. You have a regular exercise regime. And walking is one of the best. It's real cheap, easy to do, and it's even better than running because you're less likely to damage your joints. Okay, running is good, but when you get a little older, then you start to pay the price. Okay, and usually the first thing to go are the joints. Okay, and then you're reminded. All that pounding, of course, eventually takes a toll. All right, and you may unfortunately end up with arthritis, like osteoarthritis, which is the old wear and tear arthritis. But walking helps. Another good thing, of course, is swimming. That takes a lot of weight off the body. You still exercise in water, and of course, biking's good too. So a lot of cheap exercise. It's just a matter of finding the time, and that's the problem. You're too busy. You're working. You got the family. Okay. If you're a mother, of course, you're probably running after kids, so you are getting exercise. That's probably one of the reasons that women live longer than men, because they're the ones that are taking care of the kids. Okay. Not the men. Okay. You know, kids crying, take care of them. You know. Fix the dinner. You know. What's for dinner? You know, that's it. Anyway. Okay, so muscular pump is one, as we've seen. And also, something we talked about before, the respiratory pump. Just like we saw lymphatic vessels. The respiratory pump, when you inhale, okay, how are you able to inhale? We talked about that in the lab. What allows you to inhale or draw air into your lungs?
diaphragm.
You're changing the air pressure. How do you change the air pressure? You're actually dropping below ambient air. You're reducing what? Or I should say you're increasing the volume of the lungs. How do you do that? You expand the thoracic cavity. And the lungs, since they're attached to walls of the thoracic cavity by virtue of the pleural membranes, when you expand the thoracic cavity, you expand the lungs as well. And remember the membranes? What are the membranes called around the lungs?
Serous membrane, the pleural.
A pleural. Okay, it's a serous membrane. A serous membrane, you should know by now, consists of 2 layers. The outer layer is the parietal layer. That lines the cavity. In this case, the thoracic cavity. That'd be parietal pleural. The other one is the visceral layer. That covers the surface of the organ within the cavity. In this case, the visceral pleural. They secrete fluid called serous fluid. They stick together. When things are wet, they tend to stick together. Okay, so when you expand the thoracic cavity, you expand the lungs. What happens when you expand the volume of the container to the air pressure or gas pressure in it? It it goes down. What you're actually doing is reducing the air pressure in the lungs below that of the ambient air. So air rushes in. It seems like we're sucking air in, but in fact what we're doing is we're reducing the air pressure and air automatically comes in. And how do we do it? Again, with skeletal muscle activity. And what are the inspiratory muscles?
The diaphragm,
The diaphragm
the external
and the
intercostal.
external intercostal muscles. The diaphragm, of course, when it contracts, pushes down slightly in the abdominal pelvic cavity. That's the floor of the thoracic cavity, and the lungs are attached, okay? And making up the sides and top, of course, the rib cage and muscles associated with it, in this case, the external intercostal muscles, they pull the rib cage up and out. Net effect, increase the volume of the thoracic cavity, increase the volume of the lungs, decrease the air pressure, inhale. What does it have to do with moving the blood, though? How does it move the blood? What are you doing when you're inhaling? You're increasing pressure in the abdominal pelvic cavity by the diaphragm pushing down, okay? And you're decreasing pressure in the thoracic cavity. So vessels, be they lymphatic vessels or blood vessels, there is now more pressure in the abdominal pelvic cavity and less in the thoracic cavity. So it facilitates the return of fluids, be it lymph or blood, from abdominal pelvic into thoracic. So that again facilitates movement of blood as well as lymph. Okay? And we call that the respiratory pump, which we talked about before. Okay? When we exhale, of course, things reverse. Now the diaphragm's coming up, okay? The external intercostal muscles are active, that rib cage coming down in, now it's starting to squeeze the lungs. Now you're decreasing the volume, so what happens to the air pressure? It goes up. Now it's higher than the air pressure around you, so now you exhale, okay? What keeps that blood from going back? The valves. What keeps it going one direction. So skeletal muscle pump, okay, it makes you skeletal muscle, okay, and the respiratory pump. So as there are changes in the pressure in your abdominal pelvic cavity and your thoracic cavity. Okay? So that's what we're talking about here. Any questions on this? Okay. Okay, so let's look at main regulators of blood pressure. And I've listed them here for you. One we've already talked about ad nauseum, cardiac output. Okay? Increase in cardiac output, increase in blood pressure. And we've been talking about peripheral resistance. Increase in peripheral resistance, increase in blood pressure. And the third one, which you only alluded to but haven't really discussed, is blood volume. So increase or decrease in any of these three result in increase, corresponding increase or decrease in the blood pressure. Cardiac output, peripheral resistance, blood volume. Increase any of the three, you increase the blood pressure. Decrease any of the three, you decrease the blood pressure. Okay? Okay, so let's look. Again, return to the cardiovascular center. This is in the brain stem, medulla oblongata. And they help to regulate cardiac output, as we've seen. What does it do as far as cardiac output is concerned? Remember we were talking about the sympathetic and parasympathetic? What does the sympathetic do? As far as the heart.
Increase.
Okay, it increases cardiac output by what? What does it do to the heart rate? Cardiac, the
Speeds it up.
sympathetic. Speeds it up. Anything else? The sympathetic?
Affects the contraction.
Increases force of contraction. Okay. Parasympathetic, what does it do to the heart rate?
It slows it down.
Slows it down. Anything in regard to the force of contraction?
No.
Why not?
It doesn't have the fibers.
You don't have parasympathetic fibers going to the ventricular
Ventricle.
myocardium. Okay, so it slows the heart rate, but it doesn't really affect force of contraction. Okay, so again, sympathetic, cardioacceleratory, or stimulatory center, and this of course regulates cardiac output by stimulating increase in heart rate and stroke volume, which we talked about before. Okay, and their stroke volume primarily due to contractility. All right. Parasympathetic cardioinhibitory center, again, part of this cardiovascular center. This regulates again cardiac output by decreasing the heart rate and maintaining the resting heart rate. As I said, it actually depresses the resting heart rate. There are no nervous connections to the heart, or it would actually beat faster than it does at rest. Average what? It's about 75 beats a minute or so, very average. there were no connection, it'd probably be more like 100 beats of your resting heart rate. Okay, but we've also got something else we haven't talked about, and that's the vasomotor center. Vaso refers to vessel. In this case, we're talking about blood vessels. So this is the part of the cardiovascular center, again in the brain stem, the medulla oblongata, okay? And here you've got sympathetic neurons that regulate peripheral resistance. And how do they do that? By changing blood vessel diameter. Stimulation by those sympathetic fibers, autonomic nervous system, stimulate contraction of smooth muscle in blood vessel walls. In other words, vasoconstriction. What does that do with blood pressure? Brings it up. Okay? Again, peripheral resistance. Now what's the major factor determining peripheral resistance? Blood vessel diameter. In other words, vasoconstriction and vasodilation. All right, the neural controls then, of course, are involved in blood pressure regulation, but for the short term. Now, how does the brain know what's going on? Well, obviously it's got receptors. We're used to sensory receptors. I'm sure you study those in AMP1. Okay? You touch the hot skillet, of course, it's hot, it burns, okay, you pull it. Reflex, all right? You're pulling away before you even thought what you're doing. And then you're like, ooh, it hurts because I touched that hot skillet. I should have known that. All right? Don't worry about that. But there are also receptors that tell the brain what's going on inside your body, and you're not even aware of it. Okay, these are interoceptors. And this is what basically tells the brain what to do with the sympathetic and parasympathetic. It's got to have input coming in, and then the output will be from the sympathetic and parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. But like I say, it's things that you don't think about. They're going on all the time, though. Okay, so we have what are called baroreceptors or pressure receptors. And what they do is they're stimulated by changes in blood pressure. Okay, we've also got chemoreceptors. As the name suggests, this basically receptor is stimulated by chemical changes, okay, various chemicals in the blood. And then, of course, also the cerebral cortex and hypothalamus. Cerebral cortex, remember, is associated with higher brain function, associated with thought and reasoning. Hypothalamus, of course, gives a lot of sensory input that's coming in, and then sends it out, basically, the cerebral cortex and various other parts of the brain. So it's sort of a gatekeeper, if you will, sending stuff out. Does a lot of things. Okay? So let's look at these receptors. Okay, first off, the baroreceptors, and these are pressure receptors. We got them in various places in blood vessels to monitor blood pressure. The brain knows what's going on as far as the blood pressure in various parts of the body. We have them in the carotid sinuses, and specifically they're in the internal carotid arteries. Remember, the internal carotid arteries are a major blood supply to the brain. What's the other major blood supply to the brain? What arteries? You should have seen that in lab. Internal carotid arteries, left and right. What are the other ones? What are the ones that run up here to the cervical foramen?
The jugular.
Jugular, those are veins. Arteries.
Vertebral artery.
What is it? Vertebral, yes, left and right vertebral. Those are the ones that run up basically through the little holes basically in the cervical vertebra. All right? The transverse foramen. Okay. So, we've got these in the carotid sinuses, internal carotid arteries, and they initiate what's called a cardiac sinus reflex. And that helps to maintain normal blood pressure to the brain, which is essential. The body will sacrifice all to protect the brain. As the brain shuts down, the body's going to go. All right? And that's why parts of the body will be sacrificed at the expense of the brain. Okay, we've also got baroreceptors in the aortic arch. This initiates what's called the aortic reflex. This aids in maintenance of systemic blood pressure. And we've also got baroreceptors in the right atrium. Remember, that's the receiving chamber, okay? And the vena cava, which of course are major veins directing blood into the vena cava. And this is called the right heart or atrial reflex, and that helps to maintain blood pressure in veins. Okay? The brain knows blood pressure up to the brain, okay? Blood pressure throughout the body, systemic, and also pressure in the veins as well. Now, as I said, we also have chemoreceptors that feed information to the brain, and this deals with chemical levels in the blood. This is blood pressure. This is level of certain chemicals. Okay? And these are located usually near the pressure receptors or baroreceptors. You find them in the carotid sinuses. You find them in the aortic arch as well. What they're really responding to are changes in chemicals like oxygen levels, very important, oxygen deficiency in particular, also level of carbon dioxide, CO2, and ion levels, particularly hydrogen ions, which are associated with acidity. Okay? And these can increase by initiating what's called a vasoconstriction reflex. All right, so the increase in blood pressure then, increased rate of venous return to the heart and lungs. All right, so we can see here neurocontrols, and these are receptors to tell the brain the pressure in various parts of the body and also chemical levels, particularly oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen ion levels. He said also involved here is the cerebral cortex and hypothalamus, and they can alter basically the blood pressure by relays basically to the cardiovascular center. Okay? And this can stimulate the so-called fight or flight, which is mediated basically by the sympathetic division, okay, through the hypothalamus, and this of course affects blood pressure. So that's why you can just be sitting there, supposedly relaxed, and be thinking about something. You're angry, okay, or upset, okay, or you're fearful, or excited, whatever, and you can bring that blood pressure up. Not even moving, really. And that's your cerebral cortex going through the hypothalamus. That's why you can actually change your blood pressure without exercise, without much movement. Okay. Blood-borne chemicals, okay? So we've got neural controls here, neuroregulation. We've also got blood-borne chemicals that are involved in short-term regulation of blood pressure. And these are largely hormones. So let's take a look at these. And I'd like you to start learning these. You're going to see more of these, and we're going to deal in more, or talk about these in more detail as we go along. Okay, first off, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now you can see that these chemicals are involved in short-term regulation of blood pressure again. And they do that by stimulating smooth muscle in our blood vessel walls. Okay? Or by stimulating the vasomotor center. So some important hormones, first of all, we talked about before, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now these two molecules are essentially very similar. Structurally they're very similar, they basically have the same effects. And you can see they're produced by the adrenal medulla. So they're found in the adrenal glands in that middle portion. And we'll talk more about this later. And released directly into the blood from the adrenal glands. And the adrenal glands, remember, actually that means next to the kidney. They usually sit atop the kidneys. And they're a very important source of very important hormones. These are probably the best known. Epinephrine and norepinephrine. So they increase cardiac output by increasing heart rate and contractility in the cardiac muscle cells. They also cause vasoconstriction in the skin, the cutaneous, and abdominal organ arterioles. But they have a different effect on cardiac and skeletal muscle arterioles. So they actually cause vasodilation. But overall, the effect of stimulation by epinephrine and norepinephrine is to increase blood pressure. Okay, so you're asked what's the function overall? Increase blood pressure. We also have another very important hormone. This is actually released by cells in the heart wall itself, specifically in the atria. Now remember, the atria are receiving chambers. They're not very muscular. They don't have to be, because all they're doing is pushing blood into the adjacent ventricles. But because they are thin walled, they're very susceptible to changes in blood pressure. If blood pressure gets too high, that can stretch the walls, overstretch, and actually cause damage. So for this reason, with the increase in blood pressure, these cells in the atria release a hormone called natriuretic peptide. Let's break that down. It comes from the atria. It's a peptide, which means it's not enough amino acids to be classified as a protein. Okay, it's small, smaller. And natriuretic, what does that mean? What is natrium? Anybody know? Don't you know your Latin? Look at the periodic table. Okay. Let's go over there to the group 1, drop down to Na. What does Na stand for?
Sodium.
Sodium. You ever wonder why Na stands for by cells in the atrium, and it's going to adjust sodium ion levels. Atriate peptide. And what it does, it causes vasodilation, which is going to drop the blood pressure, which is what the atria want, because too high blood pressure, you get overstretching and damage the walls. And it promotes more sodium ion excretion by the kidneys. Now, why is this important? I think a little while ago I mentioned that water follows the solids. In this case, sodium ions. So if the kidneys excrete more sodium, they also excrete more water. They produce more urine. When they produce more urine, they drop the blood volume and they drop the blood pressure. That's how this works. Okay? It's a vasodilator right off. Relax that smooth muscle, increase the lumen, drop the blood pressure, but then it stimulates the kidneys to void more sodium and with it more water. So they produce more urine, reduce the blood volume, reduce the blood pressure. Okay?
Professor?
Yes.
I thought if you reduce the water in the blood, you actually made it more vicious.
You did what?
If you reduce the water in the blood, it became more viscous. Vicious?
Viscous?
Viscous.
Vicious, what could be vicious? Viscous, okay. Well, what you're doing is basically you're reducing blood volume by the kidneys losing more water. Not enough basically to affect the viscosity that much,
Oh,
but it's
okay.
enough basically to change the blood volume, and when you change the blood volume, you drop the blood pressure.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm not talking extensive, but enough to change that blood pressure.
I was getting rid of the
Okay.
sodium.
Remember, as I said, there are three things that affect blood pressure. What are they? Cardiac output, peripheral resistance, and blood volume. So this is reducing blood volume, therefore reducing blood pressure. Okay. We got another one. You're going to hear a lot about this one, called ADH, which stands for anti-diuretic hormone. Okay? Which tells you what it does. What's a diuretic?
Gets rid of water.
When you're out for a night out of town, you're usually drinking a diuretic. An alcoholic beverage. Let's say you don't touch a drop, or you're drinking a fluid. Caffeinated beverage, it's your coffee. Or maybe a cola, spiked with caffeine. Okay? Where do you spend part of that evening? In the bathroom. Why? Because you're drinking a diuretic, which promotes urine formation. So a diuretic is something that promotes urine formation. All right? Antidiuretic reduces urine production. So ADH, you can see, it's going to be released by the posterior part of the pituitary. We'll talk about that later. And it causes the kidneys to secrete less water. They absorb more water, build up the blood volume, build up the blood pressure. Anti-diuretic. By producing less urine, you have more water in the blood, build up the blood volume, and lower the blood pressure. Okay. And there's another name for antidiuretic hormone. It's also called vasopressin, which also tells you what it does. It constricts blood vessels. It's a potent vasoconstrictor. And a vasoconstrictor is going to constrict the lumen, bring up the blood pressure. When you have a massive hemorrhage or blood loss, the pituitary dumps a lot of vasopressin or ADH in the blood. What this does is cause vasoconstriction, and that helps to maintain blood pressure, so you get enough blood to your head. So that's a standard thing that occurs. Okay, so overall the effect is by increasing blood volume and causing vasoconstriction, ADH increases blood pressure. Okay, so we see that epinephrine and norepinephrine increase blood pressure. ADH, antidiuretic hormone, or vasopressin also increase blood pressure. Natriuretic peptide decreases blood pressure. Okay, these are all hormones basically that are affecting vasoconstriction, vasodilation, or they're affecting blood volume. Okay. Any questions? But that's not the end of the story. There's some more. Okay. Whoops. Okay, we talked about norepinephrine and epinephrine essentially do the same thing. Atrionatriuretic peptide. We talked about ADH, antidiuretic hormone. And then you can see endothelium. Well, no surprise, that's released by what? endothelial cells, which line all blood vessels. We've talked a lot about that in regard to what? Coagulation. Okay, remember? These guys also are involved in vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Endothelin basically is a vasoconstrictor. It causes smooth muscle contraction, narrows the lumen, brings up the blood pressure. Okay? But these same cells also produce nitric oxide. Chemical formula is NO. Okay, so it's not NO, it's nitric oxide. And it has another fancy name, it's called endothelium-derived relaxation factor, which means what? It's a vasodilator. So these cells can work either way. They can release endothelin, constrict the vessel, bring up the blood pressure. They can release nitric oxide and dilate the blood vessel rather, and drop the blood pressure. Same cells. Very versatile. Okay. Then we talk about some inflammatory chemicals, histamines and kinins, and these are released during the process of inflammation. Okay. We see them a lot, for example, with allergies. What do? They cause vasodilation. What does that mean? You're increasing the blood flow to an area. The capillaries become more permeable. Okay. What happens? You're losing blood. You're losing water from the blood. You're dropping the blood volume, and thus you're decreasing the blood pressure. Okay. Think about what these are doing. Increase blood volume, increase blood pressure. Decrease blood volume, decrease blood pressure. Then alcohol. Okay. Alcohol inhibits ADH release. What does ADH do? Retards urine formation. That's why when you're drinking alcohol, you're dehydrating yourself. Because, and the morning after, okay, you feel, you know, like what? Why? Because you're severely dehydrated. So the last thing you want to do is the hair of the dog, okay? You don't take more of the same. And that's just going to dehydrate you further. What you need to do is rehydrate. Okay? And alcohol then, because it reduces blood volume by promoting urine formation, decreases blood pressure as well. Nicotine, which often accompanies alcohol consumption, okay, is a vasoconstrictor. And it's hard, especially on the heart and vital organs, what to do. Vasoconstriction reduces blood flow to the heart. At the same time, since you're inhaling a lot of smoke, of course, what's in the smoke? Among other things, carbon monoxide. And carbon monoxide actually has a greater affinity for hemoglobin than the oxygen. So you're actually loading up your hemoglobin with a lot of carbon monoxide, which is toxic stuff, as you know. You can die by inhaling too much carbon monoxide. And it has no odor to it. That's why sometimes people have a carbon monoxide leak. They got the charcoal grill there in a camp or something, which you never should do, and they never wake up because basically they die from carbon monoxide poisoning. So nicotine then causes vasoconstriction, which of course brings up the blood pressure. Okay? So you're saying, well, I drink and I smoke and I can keep it about the same. Okay? Doesn't work that way. And two, you've probably seen these cartoons, okay, with a St. Bernard with a barrel, and I think it's usually brandy, with a stranded skier. Is that really a good idea? You have somebody who's probably suffering from hypothermia, alcohol, which causes what? Vasodilation, which means what? You're going to increase blood flow to the skin, which is going to increase the hypothermia. You're going to radiate more heat, and if you're not already in hypothermia, you're going to go into it. Okay? Not a good idea. Give alcohol to a person who is cold and freezing, okay? Get in front of a hot fire. Okay? Anyway. Okay, so we've seen short-term blood pressure regulation by the nervous system, okay? Simulating smooth muscle contraction, for example. We've also seen it with these various chemicals, which you should know. Which ones do what? Which ones are the vasoconstrictors? Which ones are the vasodilators? Which ones adjust blood volume and thus blood pressure? And then, last but not least, the kidneys. Kidneys do a variety of things. And we don't think much about it. All we think of the kidneys, or the average person on the street says, well, they get rid of waste products. Yeah, that's true. Very important. But kidneys also are the major long-term regulator of your blood pressure. And how do they do it? By altering blood volume. When they produce more urine, you drop the blood volume, you drop the blood pressure. When they retain more fluid, produce less urine, bring up the blood pressure, blood volume, and bring up the blood pressure. That's how they do it. Okay? They can do it one of two ways. The so-called direct mechanism, and this involves increasing what's called the renal filtration rate. Now, the renal filtrate is what comes out of the blood into the kidney tubules, which we'll talk more about later when we get to the urinary system. It's not urine yet. When it flows through the kidney tubules, what's called a nephron, which is a function in the kidney, is called a renal filtrate. Eventually it becomes urine. That's what's expelled. Okay? Well, by simply taking more fluid out of the blood, reclaiming less, okay, you can change the blood pressure. Okay? So increase blood volume or arterial blood pressure, what they do is they produce more urine, that drops the blood volume, drops the blood pressure. So by increasing or decreasing that renal filtration rate, they can increase or decrease blood volume, and with it, increase or decrease blood pressure. That's called the direct mechanism. When the blood volume decreases, blood pressure decreases, then they reduce the renal filtration rate, and that means they produce less urine, less water is lost, blood volume is greater, built up, increase the blood pressure. Direct mechanism. By how much fluid they're having, how much fluid they're reclaiming, or how much urine they're producing. Okay? That's the direct mechanism. They also do what's called an indirect mechanism. This involves some hormones. A few new hormones to the mix. Okay, this is called the renin-angiotensin mechanism. When there's a decrease in your arterial blood pressure, there are cells in the kidneys that release an enzyme called renin. What the renin does is it catalyzes a series of reactions, a cascade or series of reactions, the end result of which is the formation of a hormone called angiotensin II. This in itself is a potent vasoconstrictor. And again, what does vasoconstricting do to the blood pressure? It increases. So right off, it helps to increase blood pressure. Okay? So it causes a systemic increase of blood pressure. But in addition, it circulates out to the adrenal glands and stimulates release by the cortex, the outer part of the adrenal glands, to release a hormone called aldosterone. Aldosterone circulates back to the kidneys and stimulates the kidneys to reabsorb more sodium ions. And since water follows the soluble, in this case the sodium ions, they also reabsorb more water. That brings up the blood volume, and again, what does that do? Increases blood pressure. Okay? Okay? So when the arterial blood pressure is too low, produces this vasoconstrictor, that helps to bring up blood pressure. But in addition, angiotensin II also stimulates release of aldosterone. That causes the kidneys to release more or increase more sodium ions absorption, more water absorption, build up the blood volume, build up the blood pressure. Okay. More water retained again in the blood, greater blood volume, and increase the blood pressure. So again, it's called the renin-angiotensin II mechanism. Renin is an enzyme produced by kidney cells that stimulates the production of this hormone, angiotensin II, the vasoconstrictor, which in turn stimulates the adrenal glands to release aldosterone, which in turn stimulates the kidneys, and more sodium, more water, build up the blood volume, build up the blood pressure. Okay? Simple, right? So again, don't try to memorize this. Think about what's going on. Physiology, you can't just memorize it and regurgitate it on the exam. You can do that with the anatomy. Okay? Anatomy basically is like a foreign language. When you're learning the vocabulary, you can't be conversant language if you don't know the vocabulary. So it is a lot of memorization. But with the physiology, you got to know what's going on. Okay? What leads to what? And it's a logical process. That's what I would like you to do here. Okay? Think about this.